It's just very hard to be in Google's position where you are this leader in this space. You have a lot of products, like I mentioned earlier, 7 different products with at least 1 billion daily users. And so it's the classic innovator's dilemma. How do you launch great new products, but also not kill the cash cows while you're doing it?
Hello and welcome to the ImagineAI live podcast with your host, Chris Madden. And today we have Nino Tasca with us. Nino, thank you for joining.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
So we're really excited to have you as a speaker for the ImagineAI live conference that's coming up on March 27th to 28th. Looking forward to seeing you in person. And we thought that it'd be fun to get a good conversation here on the podcast as well. Could you tell us what you wanted to be when you grew up?
I wanted to be an athlete. I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, and was a big fan of the Cleveland Browns. So I wanted to be wide receiver for the Cleveland Browns. And I thought that was the case until about, say, 10th grade in high school, where the genetics had another plan for me. But unfortunately, I had a pretty good backup plan that I did good in school, always, especially in the math and science areas. Without knowing too much of what an engineer was, I worked with my guidance counselors, people I trusted and respected. And they pointed me to engineering as a good route for the future. This is in the 90s, before software engineering became big. So I looked up what the best engineering school was, and I found Lehigh University had the nickname The Engineers. Seemed like a great fit. It was in Pennsylvania, not too far away. So I ended up going to went to go to Lehigh University and became an engineer.
Wow. I also was really good at math, and I took an engineering 101 class in college, and I just heard about all these different fields of engineering you could go into, and I couldn't make up my mind on, nothing was calling my name, and I ended up going into a more humanitarian route. And I wonder what called you into computer engineering specifically?
Yeah, so I actually didn't get a major in computer science or EE. I got one in industrial and systems engineering, or IE as we called it, which I thought was great. It's a major I recommend for anyone because it's a great combination of business and engineering and really system design. And so what really learned from industrial engineering was how to take big, complex problems and break them down into solvable chunks, which basically I've used in my life every day since. The details of some of the classes in industrial engineering I never used in real life. Some of those were metal machining and material science, good knowledge bases, but just not applicable. But the real core of what we learned in industrial engineering classes was operations and system design. Once again, all about big, hairy problems that seem impossible, whether it's designing a factory for Bethlehem Steel, which was one of the partners back in the 90s in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, where Lehigh was, or architecting an AI system. Technology changes, but the functionality and the core way of thinking about a problem really hasn't moved all that much. It's how do you take very large problems, break them down, optimize individual results, and succeed.
Great. And I see you went to NYU Stern as well. Can you talk about that? And did you work before that?
Yeah, I was an engineer. It was one of those things that this is .com bubble, or early .com, I should say, before it was a bubble. Coming out of school, even though I had an industrial engineering background, realized pretty quickly that the internet just had a huge opportunity that I wanted to be part of that wave. I mean, I always knew to code, but was never an engineer per se or a computer scientist per se, but enough to actually learn on the job, do some things well. And it turned out I was quite fast. I wasn't the best computer scientist ever, but I was quite fast, which turned out to be useful at the time period. So I had a number of engineering jobs, but what it turned out while I was working, I spent much more time trying to focus on like the business problems and how to really improve the overall customer user experience than optimizing C++ code per se. And so that was an opportunity while I was working as an engineer to go to NYU part-time. I was living in New York at the time. And, I would work from, let's say, 8 in the morning, 9 in the morning till 5 o'clock, 5:30 all day, and then take the train down to Washington Square and go to classes from 6 to 9 for 2 or 3 days per week. So I did that for about 3 or 4 years. Pretty taxing, right? Because you're working and you're going to school at the same time, but definitely rewarding. I think the biggest thing that I learned at NYU was how to think big. Sometimes when you're focusing, from an individual company's perspective, you focus on the micro and, how to solve individual problems. The best thing I learned about business school was that macro view, how to really think big and try to really go after an opportunity with all you got.
So I noticed you started at NYU Stern in 2001. Were you there for the terrorist attacks?
Yeah, I lived in New York from 99 through 20. 2013, I think, a couple of years in Europe. So yeah, we were there. My wife and I, or my girlfriend at the time, we lived less than half a mile away. So yeah, we had quite a big experience, but it was crazy 25 years since, but a day none of us will ever forget.
For sure. Switching from that, how did you get your job at Google?
Hard work, right? Hard work and knowing people. So I say it's hard work because I joined after the first wave. So Google was already a very profitable company. They had IPO'd and they were going to mass scale. So I think when I joined, there was still, Google's about 30,000 people compared to the 180,000 or so it is now. So it's grown quite a bit. And I think I was on that second wave where we're starting to get from like the IPO stage up into a really big company. I realized prior to that, at the jobs that I had, I was always in technology and product jobs. And I just wanted to work with the best. I consider myself a lifelong learner. And I just wanted to be the dumbest person in the room, soaking information from as many people as possible. So I was always really aspired to, work at a company like Google just because of the discipline of the way they use data to solve problems, the way that the best idea won and was less about politics, which was, certainly true back in the day. And so I say it was hard work because you just don't post your resume online and get a job there. So I worked my network. I had a couple of, really key contacts that friends to this day that really opened amazing doors for me and helped push me to the top, helped me get the right interviews, helped me prepare, understanding that I had the right aptitude, the right skill set. But sometimes you need people to open the door. So I looked for those contacts and I worked hard. I probably studied several hundred hours just for the interview portion of the Google hiring process, making sure my knowledge matched what they were looking for. I got in the door. It took many, many, many interviews, but I studied, I worked my network, and then a little bit of luck helped along the way as well. And I was there for 10 years. So I think it was successful for both sides. I did some good work for Google and it certainly shaped me into the person I am today.
Yeah, that's amazing. Maybe you could talk about the key takeaways you've learned from working with such a massive company such as Google.
Yeah, where do I start? The biggest thing I learned from Google was just the quality of people and working with talented people. That I knew that going in, and it's just so true, right? Being at any conversation, the person across the table from you, probably someone that was graduated top of their class, super curious, has great ideas, has great life experience. I remember one that we were having a conversation about satellites in our little kitchen area, and some guy that walked in had all this information, was very, very factual on all these details about satellites. I asked, how do you know so much? He's like, I used to work at NASA. I was like, oh yeah, of course you do. This is kind of the conversation. At your average kitchen, you have people that think they're an expert in things. At Google, you actually have a NASA rocket scientist that walks into your conversation and can give you factual information. So that was the great thing, was just working with really smart people in everyday applications, no matter if they're, the SVP of the company who has, some of the biggest problems on their plate, or somebody that's new right out of school wants to learn from people like me that were more experienced. Just a lot of ideas, just a lot of creativity. Just you can tell when you have these people that are just really bright and will put in the work to find the right answer. So it was great to work with such a great, talented group of people.
Did you ever meet Larry and Sergey?
I did, only once. They had this thing called TGIF where we get to demo products at the show. So I joined. Larry was still CEO, probably the first year or two. I forget exactly when the transition happened to Sundar. So it was pretty early in my tenure. But once I was able to present something we were working on for the Google Assistant on TGIF, so I got to present basically to the whole company. And Sergey and Larry were still, I think they were not CEOs at the time. They were already moved on to the board of directors, but they were there. And I came off and I think Sergey fist bumped me once. So that was my full interaction. And then they pretty much disappeared for like 8 years. And then at the end, I think this has been reported in the press, Sergey's taken a renewed interest in what's going on with AI. So he started coming back in, let's say, mid to late 23. So I interacted with him in the cafeteria a few times, but I did not have those early 2000 experiences where Larry and Sergey were doing the hiring by themselves or in all of the product reviews. So
you were an AI product director at Google. Can you speak to the program there, Google's AI efforts?
There's a lot of generalists at Google, especially in product management. So I was a director of product management. The areas I focused on early in my career were ads. And the second half of my career, I was really one of the founding members of the Google Assistant team. So kicked that off the ground. And I focused on the core technologies, which was really speech. The Google Assistant, I'm sure everyone knows, we had a very successful launch in 2016, 2017, and it's sort of been embedded in many devices, including hundreds of millions of Android devices, ever since. But speech is what starts it all, starting off by saying, hey, Google, asking it a query with understanding natural language and getting a response back with the TTS. So we had lots of people working on different parts of the problem. But my area of focus was really the speech component, which started and ended every conversation. And so that was built on all AI technologies, everything from how we collect the data, the different types of AI training we do. And of course, that's seen quite a few evolutions in the 10 years since I joined, just as new models come out and how we can make more powerful, smaller models sometimes, and sometimes larger, more powerful models.
Was there any breakthrough moment with the Google Assistant and the AI technology?
Yeah, I think the biggest breakthrough moment was when speech recognition got good enough to actually build products off of. It's funny, going back, speaking of, Larry and Sergey, we picked up old patents from them like the early 2000s. And you find something about speech recognition where I think Sergey said, we think it'll be good enough to get 60% accuracy for like the top 10 results. Very, very, very low bar. And so what we found through our test was the way you measure speech accuracy is called word error rate. So if someone, let's say, dictates 1,000 words, what's the percent that you get wrong? Lower is obviously better. Now with certain data sets, Google's gotten into, 3%, 4%, so pretty low and actually better than humans in certain contexts. But the key moment was around when you get to that between 10 and 15% word error rate, which actually sounds pretty high, but it's good enough to do applications like the Google Assistant. When you're at 20% word error rate, the errors are just too frustrating. The type of mistakes it'll make will break up your workflow, whether it's asking the Google Assistant for a query or trying to do voice typing on your phone. I know you guys have all done this. When you gets the word wrong, but it takes you out, you've got to start using your fingers to edit, which isn't a great experience. What we found was like when you get between that 10 to 15% sweet spot, it's like a 0 to 1 moment. Something that didn't work at all is now good enough to actually work and build these new product experiences. We had a similar moment with something we call on-device speech. So the way the assistant used to work was everything was in the cloud, which created a very latent heavy process. You ask a query, your data's got to go to the cloud, speech recognition comes back, something happens. It's very much a turn-taking approach. When we moved speech on device, which was a combination of chips getting better and us shrinking our models to a size that could run on those chips effectively, that's where magic happened again, where the latency went down to near zero. And you could actually see, for example, if you were doing voice typing on Gboard, for example, you're seeing the words come as fast as you talk. That's once again what I call like a 0 to 1 experience, because with the latency, it was almost an unusable product. But as soon as that got to zero latency, it becomes much more usable. And quite frankly, I rarely type on my phone nowadays. I'm using voice all the time.
You've worked at Google for the last 10 years, from 2013 to 2023. What were some of the biggest changes that you noticed in the Google culture during that time?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing is Google got much bigger. And the way we realized we could succeed at Google was by building better products together, where things were integrated. So there was a meme that definitely was true at some point. You could argue is still true today, that Google shipped really great technology and Apple shipped really great products. Because at Google, where it was kind of built based on the university ethos of, Stanford, that everyone would work on their own little thing and they would sort of ship it. And that was even, true in my own case. We have a better speech model and we would just ship it. But how do you integrate all of these different systems together? And so what happened is realizing that we weren't just a technology company, but we were a product company. We had products people relied on. Billions of people were using, I think, at least 1 billion people were using 7 products daily, which is just a mind-blowing number. The best way to make those products was integrating seamlessly. And as Google grew, that became harder and harder because there are more products to integrate with, more people to work with. And so launching any one product became much, much more difficult, because it wasn't just making sure it fit in your use case. It was making sure it fit in everyone's use case. And then what happened is, I don't want to say it was lowest common denominator, because that's probably not the right term, but you couldn't move as fast as you would like to because you had to wait for sort of all of these releases to go together. And it definitely slowed down the pace of innovation and created a lot of unnecessary meetings and working with, well, I shouldn't say unnecessary. I should say a lot of meetings, right? Because I actually believe in that principle. I think the work that the Googlers do, we should be working on behalf of the customer and the user and making sure that the user experience is as great as possible. So I believe in that ethos that shipping things together as a final product is the right approach, but the culture of having to do everything and integrating with so many different products definitely changed over time while I was there.
Looking at the recent news, the Google's Gemini kind of botched launch, do you have any take on that and what you see that they did wrong, could have done better?
Yeah, so Google admitted, Sundar, Larry, they both admitted they got it wrong. So I'm not here to kick them while they're down. I think it's very clear they got it wrong. I should also say I have still friends to this day that work on it that are very, very smart people. I think the challenge in looking at it from Google's perspective, understanding they had smart people working on the problem, it's just very hard to be in Google's position where you are this leader in the space. You have a lot of products, like I mentioned earlier, 7 different products with at least 1 billion daily users. And so it's the classic innovator's dilemma. How do you launch great new products, but also not kill the cash cows while you're doing it? And even though some of the, we'll call it the wokeness that has been called out in the press, it's unfortunate because it is something that I think they over-indexed on, but they were doing it from an area of weakness in the past, where I think there are definitely a few examples where Google got it wrong the other way. So it's one of those things where I think they had the best intentions, but the best intentions were probably over-indexed on. Sundar sent out an email a few, maybe last week or so, and I think they said they'd be looking at this and try to fix it. I think the recognition is a good area, and once again, I love the technology they produce. I have great friends that still work there. So I'm definitely betting on them. And the first step is definitely recognizing that they got it wrong here and hopefully putting in systematic change that isn't just correcting this problem, but correcting it from happening again.
Sundar's been in the spot for a long time as CEO. Can you speak to his leadership, and do you think he's still the man for the job at Google?
The only person that decides that is Larry, right? Larry and Sergey will decide if he's the man for the job, and they have more data than me. Sundar takes pride, and once again, he said this publicly, so I'm not breaking any confidence or trust here. He likes to take time to make decisions. I think he believes that, once again, when you're usually operating from Google's position of strength, taking time lets more data come in. Once again, a very data-driven company. So the more time you take, the more data can come in, and it increases the chance of the best decision being made. That's worked wonderfully well. Once again, Google has one of the greatest runs in history of business. Now, could it have been better over the last 5 years? I think, yes, there's been competitors that have, increased their market cap better. The question I think that the Google board has to ask itself, one, does Sundar's leadership style, where waiting to make decisions, his default status quo, is that right for this environment where AI is so ripe? And if it's not, can Sundar change, or do they need another leadership style or culture style to help lead that company and show that, yes, that might have worked for several decades now, but that traditional model may not always work in the future as well. So I think that's the two big decisions. If they need to decide, I'll let Larry and Sergey decide if he's the right person to do that or not. But I think those are the two clear areas that really need to be ironed out.
Well, thank you, Nino, for diving deep into your time at Google. I'd like to transition now to what you're working on now.
Yeah, thank you. So I was at Google for 10 years, and that felt like a good time, right? I think aspiring for 10 years was a good goal I had, and we achieved that. But for my next journey, I was looking for something completely different. I didn't want to just join another big tech company because I sort of had my learnings at Google, and I wasn't going to compare, going to a Meta or an Amazon. It wasn't what I was looking for. So when I started looking and deciding what I wanted to do next at this time last year, I really wanted to look, and I knew I wanted to be deep in AI. It was pretty obvious. That was my history for the last 10 years, but also where obviously all the hype was going. And I never want to be a guy that's following the hype train. And so I looked at what really makes a company successful in this wave of AI. And I kind of identified 4 different things. One was talent, having the right talent to actually, train and build these models. The second was compute, which compute being such a key resource, which companies would have the compute to do this. The third was proprietary data. Eventually, there's going to be enough open source models trained on the open web. Who has proprietary data that can actually build some unique and compelling models? And the fourth was existing business lines. When I looked at a lot of the startups that were emerging in AI, one of the challenges that I saw is that they had no business, no distribution, and they were leading from technology first approaches, which, going back to my business school days, it was something I always wanted to do the opposite of. I wanted to first solve a business problem. And so once again, the 4 areas identified were talent, compute, proprietary data, and existing business that, needed to be solved. And so several companies have all 4 of those, but not everyone. And Google does. But I looked at it, okay, you don't need all 4 to succeed, because models are now available through GCP, Google Cloud, or AWS, or OpenAI. And compute can be rented. So I was looking for smaller companies where I could have a real impact that had both proprietary data and existing business lines. And I wanted to find a company that was really ripe, where AI could be a breaking point for them. They would either be totally disrupted and out of business in 5 years, or we could use AI as an opportunity to sort of leapfrog and move ahead based on things that were not possible just even a few years ago, would now be possible with AI, and can help build up these existing business lines into something, much greater than they are today. So, through my networking, once again, I actually was able to connect with one of my former bosses who's become a friend. I worked with him 20 years ago at a company called Ziff Davis, and he had just taken over as CEO of Northstar, which is a B2B media company. And we'll get to that in a second. And he had the exact same hypothesis as I did, right? How can we take great technology and apply it to traditional businesses to really accelerate growth? Just so happened that I knew the guys that owned Northstar from a private equity perspective because they had owned one of my previous companies that had a very successful exit. Northstar also focuses on the travel industry, which I've been very close to for the last 25 years. My wife's in it, and I've always loved the travel industry. So it was this confluence of all these different factors that came together. It was the right time for me to leave Google. People that I knew that were running a real company that had an aptitude for change. I loved the travel industry. And most importantly, it was a great business with proprietary data that was on the verge of disruption. And so I was able to join as the chief product officer just a few months ago.
Wow, congrats. Can you talk a little bit more about the business and what the disruption that is potential and what you're trying to do to navigate that disruption?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's in the travel industry, but it's a B2B media company, so business to business. As it so happens, I have quite experience early in my career in B2B media. For those that don't know B2B that well, it's considered trade publications. So it started out, with usually magazines focused on very individual or niche topics. The good thing about B2B media is that although the size of the audience can be very small, advertisers really want to reach that audience, and B2B media companies can serve like an amazing purpose. So in the travel industry, for example, we cover basically everything that goes on in travel, both on what we call a retail side, which is, consumers going on travel using a travel agent or an advisor to help them plan a trip to Italy, a cruise, Africa safari. Still a very thriving business, and actually travel is growing higher, especially outside of the pandemic. It's growing really higher than any different sector. On the other side of travel, we have the business side, which is my wife is in. It's the meetings group and the technology group and the corporate management of travel. So people, for example, want to rent a hotel to have a business meeting, a conference like ImagineAI, right? You have to work on the meeting side of business and figure out, okay, which hotel can host my meeting? How do I get the right rooms? How do I get the right block of rooms for my guests to come? So there's a whole business that goes into that as well. And Northstar sits in the middle, where we have people that are the advertisers, if you will, or the suppliers, the hotel companies, the airline companies, the cruise companies that really rely on Northstar to connect them with professionals in the industry, whether it's professional meeting planners, travel agency companies that are really spending almost half of travel is impacted by these professionals. It's not just you or I going on to Expedia and booking a flight. The majority of travel, especially the high end of it, still happens through a travel professional. So Northstar plays this role of being the connector of, knowing our audience really well, building up audience with great content, events, and education, and also working with our suppliers or advertisers to make sure we have the match. So, when I joined Northstar, there is proprietary data. We have some proprietary content, but also a lot of data on our audience. And the framework I looked at three different things for how AI could really propel Northstar forward. The first was I looked for, what's our cash cow? What's the one thing we do really well and, the business is dependent upon? And that's exactly what I said. It's connecting advertisers with our audience. And that's all about data flow. And so it's understanding who our audience is made up of and how connecting them with our advertisers can be, beneficial to both parties. And it really is. Like, I know sometimes advertising gets a bad rap, but in the case of Northstar, it's actually not the case because, for example, if you're a cruise company, you need people to sell the ship. And if you're a travel agent, you want to seem knowledgeable about all that's happening in the cruise industry. So you actually need to work through Northstar to understand what's happening in the cruise industry, what are the newest ships, what are the best new classes that are coming out, the best new voyages, and being able to relay that to your customers. So advertising doesn't get the dirty word that it does in other parts of the industry, because I almost see it like as a distributed sales force. And so AI we can use to get better data flow back and forth between both the advertisers and suppliers to make richer and more meaningful connections. So that was one. I mentioned one was the cash cow. And the second was really looking at parts of the business that were ripe for like a 10x change with UX. Especially with generative AI, if you look for how people actually search and source their vacations, we've all seen what we call OTAs or online travel agencies that you do a search, say from, going from New York to Italy. We're all familiar with the results, and you get 1,000 different hotels and flights and many options. That becomes overwhelming. With generative AI and proprietary data like Northstar has, we believe we can make a much better UX experience for not just end users, but also travel agents to make them more knowledgeable, to help them put together great vacation packages for their users. So looking at it from both perspectives, what is your cash cow that people are going to disrupt? What's the saying? I think it was Bezos, your margin is my opportunity, right? So we had a margin there. So we're trying to protect that and put more AI and more data into it to do that as efficiently as possible, but then also being a disruptor ourselves, looking at the data we have, and building a new experience that we just possibly couldn't do a year ago. But now combined with our data and the base model technology that's out there, we can build, we think, better technology than literally anyone out there because we have that unique data.
That's fascinating. As a big travel buff myself, this is an exciting future where things are streamlined more. And how long have you been working with Northstar right now?
I think 4 months now, yeah.
So Nino, you mentioned that your wife is a big travel enthusiast in the travel industry, that you've liked to travel yourself. How many countries have you visited?
Last I counted was 39. I kind of cheated though. We lived in Prague in Europe for 2 years when I was in my early 30s. Before we had kids, and we basically traveled like every other weekend. So, we got like 25 countries in 2 years there, just going to Italy for the weekend or Turkey or Greece. So we got really lucky that I got to count off a lot of countries. But one of the things that, we still love to travel to this day. I try to go to a new country every year, some years more successfully than others. And my wife is a big traveler. She's actually Italian herself. So we go to Italy quite a bit just to, visit family. And I think this year we're planning a big trip to Tokyo with not just us, but some family friends, taking our daughters together and their best friends. So I think we'll have a good time to share the experience, not just through our own eyes, but through our kids' eyes as well.
Oh, that's amazing. Same here. 4 years I lived in France and was able to knock off tons of countries in Europe during that time. And yeah, now in South Korea, can slowly take off these Asian countries as well. So I think you'll have a great time in Japan. Do you know what you're going to be speaking about at the ImagineAI Live conference?
Yeah, I think it's the exact framework, right? The biggest thing is everything that's happening in Gen AI, I get a big sense of FOMO, or fear of missing out, from everyone. Like, you're looking at all these big companies with all these announcements, whether it's, we can this many billion tokens, and people in 99% of the businesses don't know how to interact with that. And so I want to share the framework that I learned. I think the good story is, and sorry if I'll be stealing my thunder from the presentation at ImagineAI, is I worked on the Google Assistant, right? It was amazing. We were the first company to launch John Legend's voice as the voice for your Google Assistant. Now every day there's like new agents that are based on celebrity's voice. We were the first one to do that. It was a really big breakthrough at the time. I had Kevin Durant do commercials for us. We went to Vegas for CES and wrapped the whole city with "Hey Google" signs. It was these really incredible launches, just amazing, a lot of buzz. And it reminds me of this Gen AI hype now. But the funny thing was the Google Assistant lost billions of dollars a year for Google. Now, I also mentioned I did ads, right? And so my first few years at Google, I did ads. And we called it machine learning at the same time, but it's called AI nowadays. I helped turn a $300 million product into a $2 billion product through AI models for better pricing and better placement. But like, nobody wanted to do a commercial with me about how you can better, change the price based on AI. Wasn't sexy at all, but it actually had a much bigger impact on the business. And now, once again, the Google Assistant's important. I'm glad Google had the chance to do that. And companies like Google do have an R&D budget for that exact reason, and they can lose money. But I'm sure 99% of the companies out there can't afford to lose billions of dollars a year on speculative Gen AI. So my goal really is to break down that FOMO. I think AI is applicable to every company out there. And that's a good use case of, it may not be in the sexy things. It may be in moving data back and forth and being smarter with how you use data. And both Gen AI can be useful there, and also just good old machine learning. And so what's the right frameworks that traditional businesses, once again, I had that 4-quadrant, and I'll put a nice chart together for the conference of talent, compute, proprietary data, and existing business models. I'm guessing most companies don't have the talent and compute to compete with an OpenAI or Google, but I'm sure those companies do have proprietary data and existing business lines. And what's the framework they can use to actually take advantage of this AI moment we're having right now? Not having that fear of missing out, but actually joining in on the fun by using AI in a way that makes sense for their business and isn't just cool little demos.
Yeah, that's great. Is there a certain LLM or product that you would recommend to businesses for managing their data?
Yeah, not at this point, right? I'd love to be there. Like I mentioned, I was only at 4 months at Northstar, so we're still trying something out. I had a great demo just today, a few hours ago, actually. And we were using a Zor model because we were Zor customers. And one of the queries was great, but it cost 75 cents per query. So there's no way we're going to put that into production, right? But it's great for using tools we know to prototype something internally. And once we play around with it and understand that it can work and how we can build different user experiences on it, there's all type of ways to make that cheaper. So maybe we'll do a Llama 2, maybe we'll go to Hugging Face, or maybe we'll just, work with some other, talented people and they're figuring out how to get our costs down. But the point is, I think, and it's a good framework as well, to sort of play around with these big models like, like Google and Amazon and Microsoft and OpenAI are releasing, but it doesn't have to be the way you productionize, and there can be smarter ways to go to production. I'm still in that journey with Northstar, but I know it's solvable based on just some of the people I've spoken to in the industry.
Well, Nino, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. Is there anything else you want to talk about?
No, you have to come to ImagineAI and hear the rest of it, right?
Yeah, definitely. And we're going to be getting all of the speeches in their entirety out on YouTube in the weeks after the event as well. So you won't miss any of Nino's surely polished speech. So Nino, thank you so much for coming on the podcast, and looking forward to meeting you in person in 2 weeks now.
Yeah, great. It's been fun. Thank you.
Are you a podcaster? Do you appreciate the power of AI to make your life more productive? Well, do I have the tool for you? Podcast AI is a company that streamlines all your post-production needs. It honestly saves me an hour or two of work every episode, and it gives me tons of ideas for marketing and social media posts. Go over to podcastai.com now to see for yourself.